Hello and welcome back to my messy sewing room. This video is all about pattern symbols. I'm going to help you be able to identify what they look like, what they mean, and help you figure out where you can find them on your pattern. It's really important that we understand what pattern symbols are. They are going to be the clues that tell you if you're doing something right or wrong when you're sewing. And so if you can understand what they are, you are going to have a good time. Okay, so here's a pattern piece that's already been cut out, and I can already see right here, I've got a pattern symbol here, I've got a pattern symbol here, here's a pattern symbol as well. So all of those are very important. It's also important that we don't throw away our pattern pieces while we're still sewing an object. Now I know this is like flimsy tissue paper that's easily ripped and you just kind of want to throw it away when you're done, but please save all of your pattern pieces until the very end and then you can throw them away. However, I encourage you to keep all of your pattern pieces because you can reuse them over and over again. I've made, I don't know, like 20 pairs of pajama pants using the same pattern over and over again. And sometimes you get done with a pattern and you're like, that was fun, but I want to do things differently. You can use those pattern pieces again and mess with them and try to get the piece of clothing to fit even better. So don't throw anything away until you're sure you're not going to use it again at the very end of this class. Okay, let's start talking about our first symbol. The first symbol is our grain line. The grain line looks like this. And on our pattern piece, you can see here's my grain line. It has a line throughout the middle of the pattern, and it's got an arrow. It goes all the way down. And this one does have an arrow down at the bottom as well. Some don't, some just have one arrow. The point of the grain line is to show us where to lay our pattern piece on our fabric. Remember that we learned that we can't just lay our pattern pieces anywhere on our fabric. The grain line shows us how to lay out our pattern so we know we're correct. So we want our grain line to be parallel with our selvage edge. So you can take a look here. There's my grain line, here's my selvage edge. That way I know I'm laying it the straight of grain. Here's what the grain line looks like in practice. You can see I've identified my selvage edge right here, and now here's the grain line of my fabric. I'm going to make sure that my grain line is parallel now with my selvage edge all the way through. That way I know I'm straight of grain. The grain line helps us get the right stretch on our fabric. I know it's kind of hard to tell, but this is a child's pair of pants. So this is the waist up here and here's the bottom. I'm going to lay that so that it's perpendicular with our selvage edge like this. And so the fabric is not going to stretch very much going lengthwise, but it's going to stretch around that child when they're wearing it. And so it's going to be nice and stretchy. So that's our grain line. We want to make sure that we're being careful with that. The next pattern symbol is called place on fold. And here's a picture of it here. Place on fold and grain line are basically the same thing. They both tell you where to lay out your pattern on your fabric. The difference is that the grain line tells you that the pattern piece is going to be cut out entirely on every single side. So here's my grain line that I used in my previous example for my small pajama pants. I cut all the way around. A place on fold means that we're going to place the pattern piece on the fold of the fabric and cut everywhere else around it except for on the fold. This is extremely important that if you have a place on fold that you don't cut the fold line. This sounds really confusing until you see this, right? So everyone hopefully had the chance to make Valentines when you were in elementary school, and you know that to make a perfectly symmetrical heart, you draw the outside of the heart on the fold of a piece of paper. So you can see that this paper is folded in half. And so when I go to cut it, I'm not going to cut this line, otherwise I'll cut my heart in half. So let me show you. Now you can see I've cut out my paper heart, but I didn't cut the fold line. That means when I open it up, I have a perfectly symmetrical heart. So the same thing is done when we make our shirts, anything that is symmetrical like this. So instead of cutting out the entirety of our shirt like this, we will place our fabric in a fold, and then this will be the fold line right here, and we'll cut everything else around it except for the fold. So when it opens up, you've got something that's perfectly symmetrical. So again, it could be on a shirt or an apron. You can imagine what it would look like if you cut down that fold. That would mean that on this hoodie right here, I would have a seam like this right down the middle, and that's something that we don't want. So you want to be extra careful. On your pajama pants, you shouldn't have a place on fold, but on your third project, you might. So you need to pay attention to that and be careful not to cut the fold. The next pattern symbol is called the cutting line. And cutting line is really simply where you cut your pattern piece apart. So for instance, when you get your pattern, you're going to have all of your pieces on one big page like this. It's kind of a pain to open, so I'm going to not open mine all the way. But you can see right here that there are different lines for different sizes. So that's what we mean by cutting line. All of these are cutting lines, but it depends on which size that you're using. In this nice pattern, you can see that each cutting line has a different kind of markation. So, okay, here's a small dash, here's dash and dots, here's large dash. They all mean different sizes. In a lot of our patterns though, they're all one solid color that look like this. So it's a little confusing when you get to certain areas on your patterns. So what I suggest doing is marking your pattern with a highlighter. So let's say that I'm a size medium. I'm going to go through the entire pattern piece with a highlighter and just highlight around that medium. So when you go to cut your fabric, you know exactly where you're cutting. Notches are our next pattern symbol. They're really important, so pay attention. Notches look like this. They're little triangles that exist on the outside edge of your pattern. They might come in 1, they may come in 2, or they may come in 3 all at the same time. What they do basically is they help us match things up when we're sewing them. So they don't really matter when we're cutting stuff out, but when we're sewing it together, that's when they stick out, literally. So as you can see with my notches here, I literally cut them out instead of in so that they're really easy to see. I kind of create a tab that will help me match up my pattern pieces. There's another tab. So they kind of look like my thumbs on my hands like this. So when I go to match up my pattern pieces, my thumbs should be matching, and that will show that I've got the right piece at the right spot. So for instance, here's the back of my child's pajama pants. It has a notch right here. So the first thing that I'm going to do when I make my pants is I'm going to stitch this line right here to this line on the other pair of pajama pants, the front. So I'm going to show you real quick what that looks like. So here I've got my 2 pattern pieces. Here's one notch and here's another notch right there. I'm going to match those up, and it's going to help me make sure that my pants are laid out perfectly before I sew them. Once I've sewn my area that the notch was holding together, or where it was like showing me that things were matched up, then I'm done with my notches. They don't serve any purpose after that, and they can be cut off, but that's what they do, is they help us match things up. And it's really important that we know that they help us match things up on the outside edge of our fabric. Because most times when we sew, we will line up our raw edges like I have here, matching up our notches. It's important to notice that double notches and triple notches are not the same thing. They don't actually match up. So you can see on this, while I have my single notches matched, these two are not touching. And that's important to know. This is my back and this is my front, and I don't want to sew those together. The next pattern symbol is dots. And you can see a picture of dots on the screen right now. And I don't really have a good example of an actual pattern piece with dots with me right now, so I kind of made my own. So apologies for my bad art. But dots kind of look like these, right? So they could be big circles or small circles. Sometimes they can be triangles, and sometimes they can be squares depending on the pattern. Typically, we're going to find dots looking like dots. That's exciting. Dots are basically the same thing as notches, except they're on the inside edge of a pattern piece instead of on the outside edge. So they help us match things up when we're sewing. Okay, so for instance, I kind of tried to draw what a patch pocket might look like the pocket that goes on the butt of your jeans. Now that's on the middle of a pattern piece, right? So it's not on the outside edge where we're typically sewing, it's on the middle. So on the butt of my pants, I might have dots that look like this. And on my patch, I also have dots that look like that. So what I can do with that is I can mark these dots on my pants, and I can match them up together like this. So it's kind of nice. Working kind of hand in hand with dots is something called your stitching line. Now you might think that the stitching line should be around the outside of the pattern piece, right? Like this should be where we're stitching, because most of the times we're stitching on the edges of our fabrics. But as you guys know from your pincushion project, we don't need to mark where we're stitching if it's on the outside edge of the fabric. We use our seam allowance for that instead. We'd use a 5/8 or a 1/2 inch, and we line up that line on our sewing machine on the throat plate with the edge of our fabric, and that is how we figure out where to sew on the outside edge of our fabric. However, if we're working with the inside edges of our fabric, like that patch pocket that I talked about just previously, that's on the the inside of our fabric, on the inner part of the fabric. So it might look like something like this, just like that. So the stitching line is just a dashed line that's going to show us where to stitch if we're not stitching on the edge of our fabric. So basically, if I'm putting my patch pocket on the seat of my jeans, I might not know where to sew unless I have those stitching lines showing me where to stitch. The next pattern symbol is called the adjustment lines, and you can see the adjustment lines right here. It's a set of parallel lines. So when you pick out your pattern, you're picking out the width, right? When you pick medium or large, you're picking based on the width of your body, but that doesn't account for the length of your body. And so if you are someone who's very skinny and very tall, you might have a hard time picking out pants for you because you get tiny pants, but they're very short, right? So when you make your own clothes, you can adjust for that height at this point. If I wanted to add length, what I would do is I would cut down the middle of these two lines and then add a piece of paper, the length that you want to add to make your pants fit, in the middle, and then tape it. So I'd cut, add paper, and then tape it so that I've expanded my pants. If I wanted to shorten my pants here, what I would do is I would find the middle of the two lines and fold right down the middle, and then I can fold those lines up, keeping my grain line intact. So it's right there is my grain line. That way I have now just shortened my pants to be whatever I wanted them to be. I want to show you why you need adjustment lines and why you can't just whack off the bottom of your pants, right? So if we think that our pants are going to be too long for us, a lot of people think, well, I'll just cut right here and then I'll fold up the bottom of my hem. And that's not a good strategy. And the reason is because our pants start to taper, which means as they go down our leg, they get smaller and smaller, except for the very end. I know it's kind of hard to see on this table like this, but my pants start to go in, and 1 inch from the bottom, they jut back out and come out the opposite direction. And the reason is we're going to create a hem on our pants by folding up the end of our pattern 1 inch. That 1 inch means that all of our lines on either side match up. And so there won't be any tucks or any folds when you go to sew them together. What most people think you can do is just cut off the extra or just fold up what you want. But I want you to see here that these no longer match up right here on either side. So what that means for you is when you sew your hem, the ends are going to tuck in and crunch and make really, really ugly tucks and folds that you don't want to. So it is best practice to use your adjustment line to figure out how and where to add or decrease length. Last symbol we're working with is called the buttonhole, and this is going to show us where to actually sew in a buttonhole on our projects. It is also maybe going to show us where to place a button so that the button and the buttonhole match up perfectly. So on the screen you'll see a picture of both of those. So what we would do is we'd mark from the pattern onto our fabric, and then we can put it into our sewing machine and actually sew a buttonhole. I will have to show you how to do that, but it's a really fun process. So you want to pay attention. If you need something that has drawstrings, you're most likely going to make a buttonhole, especially even in your pants if you're going to have a button as well. Now that you've had a chance to learn all about the different pattern symbols, I'm going to have you take a look in your actual pattern and see if you have those on your pieces that you need for this project. So you're going to take apart all of that tissue paper. It's kind of a lot, so just make sure you have a big area to spread out. Make sure you don't lose any of those pieces of paper. Find the patterns that you're going to need, or the pattern pieces that you're going to need, and look for those pattern symbols so that you can be aware of them. The main one you really need to pay attention to is if you have any place on fold. If you do, remember that one takes extra special precaution. We don't want you to accidentally cut your hoodie or your apron in half. When you're done finding all of your pattern symbols, make sure to go back and study what you've just written. You can rewatch this video, although it is kind of long now. You can also study a Quizlet on Google Classroom because there will be a quiz on this. This is really important that you know this and that you don't just retain it for just now, because it's going to come back later and you're going to need to know it. Good luck!